Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom, and we're here to discuss a beautiful book that is filled with history and compelling photographs. It captures the evolution of one of the most famous neighborhoods in the world, and the book's title is At Home in the President's Neighborhood by Bruce M. White. Welcome to our show, Bruce.
Thank you for having me.
Bruce White is a fine art and architectural photographer and was a staff photographer at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He was a photographer for a groundbreaking book published in 2000 titled The White House, Its Historic Furnishings and First Families by Betty Monkman. His current book, also published by the White House Historical Association, presents a contemporary view of Washington, D.C., and we see the neighborhood as the president sees it from the White House. Introduced by historian William Seale and narrated with the words of American presidents and first ladies, this book presents a contemporary view of one of our nation's most famous neighborhoods. Bruce, we're going to show our viewers in Arlington how easy it is to travel to our president's neighborhood, but first we're going to have a slideshow presentation from all the great photographs in this book. And I want to start off with my first question. How did you begin this book project?
This book of photographs is really an outgrowth of the work that I do at the White House for the White House Historical Association and the Office of the Curator.
Okay.
Photographing the historic collections, the rooms, and the objects that are in the White House. And I basically started taking photographs of the neighborhood of the White House just because it's so beautiful, interesting, and vibrant. And these photographs form the core of what's in the book.
Wonderful. And how many photographs are in your book, you think?
There's approximately 180.
Okay.
I should count them again, but about 180 photographs that have never been published anywhere before.
Terrific, terrific. Now, let's discuss your panoramic book cover. It's so beautiful. Where did you set up your equipment, and how long did it take you to get this expansive shot?
This photograph was taken on, I think it was the 10th floor of an office building at the end of Connecticut Street where it meets Lafayette Park. And I spent about 2.5 hours at sundown one day standing on a balcony in February in freezing cold and driving wind and waiting and waiting and waiting for the right light. You know, the park itself, all of the streetlights were out in the park, so that looked like a big black hole. And it was really not very satisfactory. But after 2.5 hours, we packed up equipment and left the balcony, and just as we did that, the lights all came on in the park.
Wonderful.
So I turned around, set up my tripod again on the edge of the balcony, and got the shot.
So it was meant to be, right?
It was, I would think so.
And also, it was interesting that you dedicated your book to Pierre Charles L'Enfant. Why did you do that?
Well, L'Enfant was the man who created the design of Washington, D.C., working with George Washington. He was an incredibly brilliant designer and a very uncompromising person, and had to fight through all kinds of bureaucracy and difficulties with the city commissioners to get his idea realized.
Yes.
And I just felt that this book really portrays what his vision ended up being, and he should get some credit for that.
Yeah, well, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
And let's briefly discuss your first impressions of the White House at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I read that you had worked with the White House, in the White House for the White House Historical Association on another book, of course. And when you were there taking photographs, did you ever run into any presidents?
Yes, although I tend to work there when the families are not in residence, because it makes it a lot easier to do what I have to do. But I have met several of the family members, and after President Obama had been elected for his first term, I was photographing in one of the rooms on the first floor and up on a ladder about 10 feet off the ground. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw this figure walk into the room, and I looked, and it was President Obama. And I almost fell off the ladder because you generally don't run into the president like that. And he was just elected, just had moved in, and was very enthusiastic and excited to be there, I think.
Oh, yes.
Wanted to know all about what was happening and why I was there.
So he was asking you a lot of questions then, right?
He for a few minutes, and he just seemed so happy to be there, and it was a wonderful exchange.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, let's start our slideshow with photos from your book. And first is a photo of the White House on page 4 and 5. And now, how many rooms are actually in the White House?
I believe it's about 180 rooms or so,
Okay.
200 rooms altogether. Many of them are small service rooms, closets, and after Truman renovated the White House, there were a lot more rooms added to the original plan
I see.
because he dug several basement levels down below what had originally been
Ooh.
there. So it's not a gigantic palace like you'll find in Europe, in the capitals of Europe.
Sure.
But it is pretty extensive.
On page 31, there is the south portico of the White House. Was it difficult to get permission to take pictures of both the interior and exterior of the White House?
Yes, I mean, you can only do that if you have special permission, and it's all sort of choreographed through the office of the curator. I know when visitors go to take to events at the White House, they take selfies and snapshots with their iPhone. But for publication quality photography, it really is a big deal to get the permission and to work around the schedule of the president.
So it can take weeks or months to do this, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, my goodness. And then on page 32 is a beautiful picture of the Washington Monument at night in your book. Was this shot taken after that earthquake in Louisa, Virginia in 2009, which caused enormous damage and took months of time to repair the monument?
Yes, yes. And I had to wait for them to take down the scaffolding that surrounded the monument. There are several pictures in the book that show the monument with scaffolding, but I really wanted one that showed the beauty of the stone, and I think that picture kind of captures the monumentality of it.
It's a beautiful picture. And on page 43, there is a lovely picture of Lafayette Square and the view down 16th Street that was taken from, I read, the White House's third floor. What else do we see in that picture?
Yes, that picture was taken from the roof of the White House, looking north, and what you see is, in the foreground, you see this monumental statue of Jackson, and then behind it you see the Chamber of Commerce building, the Hay Adams Hotel, St. John's Church, and the Veterans Administration building, and then you're looking north up 16th Street.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful shot. And then on page 47 is the northeast corner of Lafayette Park and Madison Place in the autumn. Can you give us any details of taking that shot?
Sure. Well, I really wanted to have photographs in all the different seasons of the year, and I think it looks beautiful in the fall.
It does look beautiful with those leaves. Oh.
Yes, and so that's a statue of Kosciuszko, the great military engineer who came from Poland to help us in the Revolution. And behind it you see Dolly Madison's house, which is a beautiful, a federal period home that's been renovated several times, but it at one point was the offices for NASA.
Incredible.
Yes.
NASA was located there.
Yes, that was their headquarters. So
well,
it's interesting.
They've grown a lot since then, right?
Yeah.
And then on page 50 and 51 is a panoramic shot of the buildings at 700 through 744 Jackson Place Northwest. And these building facades are on the west side of Lafayette Park. I enjoyed reading that Jackie Kennedy's quote about this street, quote, "The wreckers haven't started yet, and until they do, the square can be saved." I mean, she was wonderful at saving these historic buildings, wasn't she?
Absolutely. She and John Kennedy were the reason that Lafayette Square was saved and that monumental office buildings weren't put up in the place of all of these Victorian houses that you see here. I mean, she saved Grand Central Station in New York City. She was a wonderful preservationist.
Really fantastic. And on page 59 is a shot of St. John's Church. And that is, where is the church exactly located?
It's on the north side of Lafayette Park, right there on H Street and 16th. And it was designed by Latrobe, who was an English architect who came over here and built several beautiful buildings, including Baltimore. And he did the Decatur House as well, which is right across the street on Lafayette Park. Beautiful church, beautiful, gorgeous.
Tell us, on page 61, tell us about the stained glass in St. John's Church.
The stained glass was a memorial window that was created for Chester Arthur, President Arthur's wife, who had passed away before he became president. And it shows scenes of the resurrection, and there's an inscription to his wife on the window. And he placed it on the south side of the church so that he could see it from the White House.
Ah, that's so sweet. There's another lovely photo of St. John's at the corner of 8th and 16th Streets. I mean, have you ever attended a service there?
I have not attended a service there. I would love to. I've just never been around when that was going on. And I should make it a point to do
Yes,
that. But the building, as you see it here, is interesting in that the columns and the portico and the church tower, the bell tower that you see, was a later addition to the church. When Latrobe designed it, it was a square cube. And that porch that you see and the bell tower was added 20 some odd years after it opened.
Well, now it's really fabulous looking.
Beautiful.
And next on page 88 and 89 is the historic Decatur House, slave quarters. Didn't Michelle Obama make a visit and give remarks about this house?
Yes. Yes, she came and she spoke and she mentioned that she thought it was important that when we look at the history of these buildings and the people who owned them and lived in them, that we talk about everybody, including the slaves who lived in these places, that was an important point to make.
And Decatur House is now an historic house that people can visit, right?
Yes. Decatur House is now, it's a National Trust property, but the White House Historical Association now operates it. And it's the David Rubenstein Center for White House History is based there. And we're working on a book now that will be another large coffee table book about the history of Decatur House.
Interesting, interesting. Now on page 96, we see a shot of Dolly Madison's home, and wasn't it almost destroyed? And what happened to the house and its contents? There's an interesting history here.
Yeah. Well, Dolly Madison seems to show up whenever there's a fire anywhere near the White House. She saved, when the British burned the White House, she saved the famous portrait of George Washington and pulled it out of there. She had collected all of her husband's papers and had secured them in 2 trunks in the house, and a fire broke out, and she managed to get the trunks out of there. She really did not have a lot of money and worked on selling these papers to the federal government, because she really needed the money. She had a son who was a terrible bad boy gambler. And he would regularly borrow money from her and blow it all on gambling. And when she sold the documents to the federal government, she received $25,000.
Which is a lot of money back then.
Serious money.
Yeah.
And he immediately blew all of it. And so the poor woman lived in
poverty,
hand to mouth.
right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so terrible.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, on page 101, we have a shot of a pair of urns cast in bronze that were made for the Lafayette Park. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, those are based on the famous Medici vase, which is in Florence, which was it's a monumental vase. This is a reduction of what the original would be.
Okay.
And it was done at a period when Americans were thinking more highly of America, and that we were now a nation. This is late 19th century. We're now a nation that really deserves beautiful cities and art and so on. There's a wonderful quote there.
Yes, yes, that's right. That's right. And we need to be on the same level as these other world capitals, right? And on page 106, we have a photo of the Lafayette Square, and they're guarded by figures of intrepid leaders of the Revolutionary War. I mean, who are these historic figures represented in this photo?
Well, you see the Marquis de Lafayette on top of the pedestal. He was the main man there. He was a young aristocratic Frenchman living in Paris. His father had been killed by the British during the war, in the 7 Years' War, I believe it was. And when he got really excited about the idea of revolution and overthrowing the monarchy, and paid out of pocket to buy a battleship, outfitted it with men and cargo, and,
That's amazing.
and sailed to America and volunteered to help the cause. And George Washington loved him. And
I bet. He was so needed, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. And Washington really came to look at him almost as a son, and along with other young men who were part of his group.
So who else is there?
Well, on Lafayette's statue, there are several generals and aides-de-camp that worked with him.
Okay.
On the other corner of the square, you have Rochambeau, who was the great military leader who came once the French government got behind what we were doing. Then there's von Steuben right across from Decatur House, who was a great military leader from Prussia, who really is really knowledgeable and helpful in terms of training our troops.
So we really had a lot of international figures involved in the Revolutionary War, didn't we?
Absolutely.
And
don't forget Kosciuszko. He's the Pole. He was from Poland.
That's right.
On the other corner. Now we've got all four.
We've got all four. And then on page 161, you have a beautiful shot of the U.S. Treasury Department. Was this Hamilton's vision? And also, it was interesting to read in your book that a king had decreed that if a king had decreed Pennsylvania Avenue, it would have been designed as L'Enfant had planned, straight from the White House to the Capitol without any diversions, just a straight arrow design. Well, what happened?
Well, L'Enfant, Hamilton really created the Treasury as we know it. I mean, he was the mastermind behind a lot of the different departments of the government. But L'Enfant's plan would have gone right through where the Treasury building stands today.
Oh, really?
However, the White House originally was going to be 5 times bigger than it is today. And when, for a number of reasons, when the scale of the house was cut back, Washington decided to re-site it further north on the property.
Okay.
And what happened was, and also there was a man who owned property in D.C. who didn't want to sell to the government.
Oh, that's so typical, right?
Right. So there were several different reasons, but in the end, Pennsylvania Avenue had to go up and make a dog leg to the right, and then left in front of the White House and go across that way.
Curve, yes,
so
right.
it really kind of destroyed L'Enfant's idea to have this beautiful long boulevard that would go all the way to the Capitol.
Yes. Well, but somehow we got there anyway.
That's right. Yes.
And then on page 199, there's an evening shot of the Willard Hotel. I mean, there's a lot of history there. Was that a difficult shot to take?
Yeah, it was. Photographing at night is always a little tricky. You're dealing with low levels of light and movement, and those don't go well together with photography.
So what do you have to do? How do you work through that?
Well, I use a tripod.
Okay,
and,
good. Good idea.
You know, this picture was taken a number of years ago before new advances in digital photography, which allow us to shoot at night more easily. But to me, it's a wonderful picture because it captures the kind of energy and the vitality of what's going on in the neighborhood around the White House.
It does. And on page 211, we have the Department of Commerce, and I learned more history about this building from your book. Can you elaborate on the Department of Commerce?
The Department of Commerce, it's a monumental building, both in Beaux-Arts and in design. It's also the place where the White House Visitor Center is now located.
Okay.
It's been photographed many times by people over the years. There's a photographer named Volkmar Wenzel who did a beautiful book of black and white photography. It's called Washington by Night, which inspired me to do some of my night photography.
Fantastic. And on page 220 and 221, there's a beautiful shot of the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. Now, what is the story behind this building?
It's an office building for government workers. It's considered by...
It's massive, isn't it?
Yeah, it's huge. It has 10 acres of office space inside of it.
10 acres.
10 acres. It's considered the finest example of Second Empire architecture anywhere in America and perhaps in the world by a lot of people. It's a beautiful building.
And then on page 232, there is the wondrous white marble Red Cross building that was completed in 1917. And what was it built to commemorate? Do you remember?
Yeah, that building was built to be the headquarters for the Red Cross in America.
Okay.
And all along 17th Street there is a row of marble buildings. The DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, built their headquarters there. The Organization for American States is there. So it's a row of gorgeous marble buildings.
You're right, absolutely. And then of course, there's the panoramic shot on page 238 and 239 of the Organization of American States. And I read in your book that when it was built in 1910, it was the Pan-American Union representing an attempt to promote cooperation among the nations of South America and the United States in commercial matters and judicial issues. And that's a beautiful building, isn't it?
Absolutely. It was kind of similar in idea to the United Nations. But yeah, it's a gorgeous, again, Beaux-Arts was the thing. All inspired by the world's Columbian Exposition, which was held in Chicago in the late 19th century, which promoted this idea of beautiful white marble, uplifting architecture. And our cities were pretty slummy looking back in the day, and this was the idea was to beautify our cities.
And it's great that they did it then, right? Because it'd be incredibly expensive now, right?
Right, yeah. Hard to do it today.
Hard to do it today, right? And on page 252, here is the Monroe House, which is now the Arts Club of Washington at 2017 I Street. And did James Monroe ever live in this home?
Yes,
He did.
James Monroe and his wife lived there, first when he was Secretary of State, and then when he became president after the War of 1812, he lived there because the British had burned down the White House, And the Arts Club, at the time the Caldwell House, became the White House. And the inaugural ball was held on the second floor of this quaint little federal period house. And it's, the Arts Club has now celebrated its 100th anniversary there, continually operated out of that building.
It's a wonderful club. On page 281, we see a shot of architect Frank Lloyd Wright's favorite building in Washington, D.C., which is the Corcoran Gallery. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, apparently he really liked it because he said it's the finest building in Washington. And it's surprising to me because it is very neoclassical in Beaux-Arts in style, and Wright was anything but that. But he felt that it was the perfect place to show art and to have classrooms about art and so on. And I find it a really interesting building. It's unusual because it's purpose-built for a specific thing, not as an office or a house.
Yes, and of course it's within walking distance of the White House, isn't it?
Absolutely.
All these buildings are. The other slide I wanted to show was 740 Jackson Place Northwest, which is the address of the White House Historical Association, where this book was brought to reality.
Yes.
So what now is it? Now this is an association that's been that's producing these kinds of books, right? And you've been involved in documenting many historic items in the city, right?
Yes, yes. The White House Historical Association was founded by Jackie Kennedy when she first came to Washington as First Lady.
Oh, that's great.
And realized that they needed to professionalize the care and documentation of the historic aspects of the White House. So part of their mission is to educate people and to publish, and books, website usage, and they do a wonderful job. I say this is kind of a golden age of publishing in Washington, D.C., because they have produced book after publication after journal of just, with new photography, the latest scholarship, and they really are wonderful stewards of the history of the presidency.
Yeah, and that is so wonderful for the American public. And Bruce, thank you so much for being here. And I want you to end this wonderful book interview with asking you, where can our viewers in Arlington find your book? Well,
you can go to the White House Historical Association gift shop,
okay,
and buy it there. You can buy it on their website, whitehousehistory.org, or you can find it on Amazon, and lots of other bookshops have it in town and around.
Okay, and now, and I want to ask you real quickly, do you have another book planned for the future? Because we would love to have you back. You're such a great guest.
I'm working on lots of books all the time, so anytime you want me to come back, I'm ready to come back. But the Decatur House book will be coming out fairly shortly. So,
okay,
yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being a guest author on our program.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. We wanted to be sure our viewers saw more of the beautiful photographs found in our featured book, At Home in the President's Neighborhood by Bruce M. White. Here is a photograph from our featured book, the Renwick Gallery, which is a branch of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Here is an outstanding night photograph of the White House, which includes a statue of former President Andrew Jackson on his horse from Lafayette Park. Next is the Blair House, built in 1824 and acquired by Preston Blair in 1837. In 1942, it became sort of a White House overflow, a house for special guests of the president. Here is a lovely close-up of the east facade of the White House. And here is a photograph of the north portico of the White House, where visitors exit after a public tour of the White House in the 21st century. And here is the south lawn of the White House, as if you were looking toward the Potomac River and the Washington Monument. Next is the daughter of the American Revolution building, which is actually named Memorial Continental Hall, and it was built in 1905 and expanded in the late 1920s. Here we see the Octagon, which was designed and built by William Thornton, M.D., the original architect of the United States Capitol. It is maintained by the American Institute of Architects, and the plan of the house resembles a fan opened up. And here is a photograph of the Bacon House, which is located at 1801 F Street, Northwest. It was interesting to read in the early years of the Republic, Chief Justice John Marshall made his home in the Bacon House when the Supreme Court was in session. Next is a photograph of the Metropolitan Club at 1700 H Street Northwest. It was founded in 1863, and almost every famous Union general was a member. And here's a lovely photo of the Renwick Gallery, a branch of the Smithsonian American Art Museum.